Arthur Morgan and Rick Grimes are two of my favorite characters in all of fiction, and the more you think about them, the more similarities they actually have. They're both great survivors and men who are willing to do some brutal things if it means keeping their people alive. Rick survived the collapse of the modern world, while Arthur spent his entire life surviving in a world where civilization had barely reached him in the first place. So I've always wondered, what if Arthur Morgan woke up inside that hospital instead of Rick Grimes? Could he keep Rick's group alive, or could he potentially lead them better than he did? Or would Arthur's weaknesses eventually destroy everyone around him? Now, to make this fair, Arthur would replace Rick at the beginning of The Walking Dead, but he would retain all of his memories and abilities from Red Dead Redemption 2. We will also use the more honorable version of Arthur, because that is the version most consistent with his character by the end of the game. Arthur's first major advantage would become obvious almost immediately: surviving alone. When Rick wakes up in the hospital, he is completely disoriented, and also Rick adapts really quickly, but he still enters the apocalypse as someone from the modern world who has never been forced to survive without civilization. This is where Arthur Morgan comes in, because Arthur practically lives as though civilization could disappear at any moment. He knows how to treat basic injuries, hunt animals, follow tracks, navigate through the wilderness, and sleep outdoors for extended periods of time. Like, these are all things that Arthur would automatically have that would put him over Rick in the beginning. Now sure, Rick has police training, but Arthur has spent decades living in camps that constantly relocated whenever the law became too close to them. Once he discovers the walkers, he would not need much time to understand the basic rules. Arthur has seen enough violence and strange situations to recognize that these people are no longer human. The hardest adjustment would be Arthur learning how to use modern firearms and vehicles. However, guns still follow these same basic principles, and Arthur is one of the best shooters in his world. Once someone showed him how to reload a modern pistol or operate a modern rifle, he would become even more dangerous than Rick with a gun. Like when Morgan's son knocked out Rick, then brought him back to their house to bring him back to a full recovery. Morgan would show Morgan the ropes of how to use a gun. You see what I did there? Morgan would be helping Morgan. Now you might say, how would Arthur know to go to Atlanta, since he technically doesn't have the same family as Rick, and that's kind of why Rick wanted to go to Atlanta. So for that, let's just say he ended up in Atlanta City because it was the closest military base near him. And when Arthur also arrives there, he would run into Glenn and the gang just like Rick did. And the group would help him survive the city because he is a survivor, just like they did with Rick. Now once Arthur arrived at the Atlanta camp, the real comparison would begin. Rick naturally becomes the leader because people trust him. He wears a sheriff's uniform, speaks confidently, and immediately begins solving problems for the rest of the group. Arthur would not have the same automatic authority. To everyone else, he would kind of look like a rough, strangely dressed man carrying an old revolver and speaking like he just walked out of another century. So right off the bat, it would be pretty hard to trust a guy that looks like that at first, because it's normal human biology to not trust someone you don't really understand or can't really relate to. Arthur would also not immediately volunteer to command everyone. He has spent most of his life believing Dutch was the leader. Even when Arthur recognized that Dutch was becoming dangerous, he hesitated to challenge him openly. This is one of the biggest differences between Arthur and Rick. Rick steps forward when nobody else knows what to do. Arthur is more comfortable becoming the person who protects the group while someone else gives the speeches. At the Atlanta camp, Shane would probably remain the official leader for longer. Arthur would initially observe him, help him with hunting, and anything else that Shane needed him to do. However, Arthur would recognize Shane's instability much earlier than Rick did. Arthur has watched Dutch gradually become more paranoid and obsessed with maintaining control, and he knows what it looks like when a man begins treating disagreement as betrayal. Shane's obsession with Lori and his increasingly reckless behavior would remind Arthur of the worst qualities Arthur eventually saw in the Dutch. The difference is that Arthur would not have Rick's emotional history with Shane. Rick repeatedly gives Shane opportunities because they were best friends before the outbreak. Arthur would judge him based on what he actually sees him as. The moment Arthur discovers that Shane aimed his weapon at him in the woods, threatened Dale, or considered killing Otis to save himself, Arthur would begin preparing for the possibility that Shane needed to be removed. Arthur wouldn't necessarily execute Shane immediately. High Honor Arthur repeatedly attempts to reason with Dutch and protect the gang without creating an open civil war. But Arthur would keep a close eye on him, and Shane would have a much harder time surprising Arthur as well. Arthur might actually prevent the final confrontation from happening the way it does in the show. He could expose Shane's behavior to the group early, force him to leave, or confront him before Shane's anger completely consumed him. If Shane still attempted to murder Arthur, Shane would he would certainly lose. Now, Rick hesitated because he loved Shane like a brother. Arthur would be disappointed, but once he understood that Shane had made his choice, he would act quickly. The farm would be another situation where Arthur might perform better than Rick. Rick spends most of season 2 trying to respect Herschel's authority because the group needs his land. Now, this is morally reasonable because it allows the tension between the survivors and Herschel's family to grow. Rick knows the barn is dangerous, yet he continues delaying a final decision. Arthur would understand Herschel better than most people. Arthur has followed men whose beliefs were collapsing around them. He knows that directly humiliating someone often makes them defend their beliefs even more aggressively. Instead of constantly arguing with Herschel, Arthur would likely speak to him privately and slowly show him that the walkers were no longer people. Now, Arthur can be surprisingly compassionate when someone is grieving. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, he comforts people who have lost family members and eventually becomes honest about his own fear of death. He would understand that Herschel was not simply being stupid. Herschel just needed to believe the walkers were sick because accepting the truth meant accepting that his loved ones were gone forever. However, Arthur would still refuse to leave a barn filled with walkers next to the camp. If Herschel would not change his mind, Arthur would quietly prepare for a backup plan. He might reinforce the barn or eliminate the walkers when Herschel was not present. Now, that could damage Arthur's relationship with Herschel, but it might prevent the chaotic massacre Shane caused. Arthur's approach to Sophia would also be different. Now, Rick desperately searches for Sophia because he feels responsible for losing her. Arthur would feel the same guilt, especially because he carries enormous regret over the people he failed to protect. But Arthur is a far superior tracker. In Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur can follow footprints, blood trails, animal tracks, and small signs most people would completely overlook. Assuming Sophia left any usable trail, Arthur would have a better chance of locating her before she reached the farm. But this does not guarantee that he would save her. The woods were filled with walkers, and Sophia was just a frightened child running around without any direction. But Arthur's tracking skills would at least improve her chances of survival even more. And besides, if Daryl was there, Arthur and Daryl, since they're pretty good trackers, could both use their experience in trying to locate Sophia even faster. Now, the prison is where Arthur might actually start having some issues. Rick transforms the prison into something larger than a temporary shelter. He clears the cell blocks, creates rules, and eventually helps build a functioning community for everybody. This is one of Rick's greatest strengths. He does not only survive dangerous places, he convinces people that they can become homes. Now, Arthur would be excellent at clearing the prison. Tight hallways would be dangerous, but his accuracy and ability to remain composed would make him extremely effective in doing so. But the problem would be Arthur's ability to imagine a future. For most of his life, Arthur moves from one temporary camp to another, and he never truly believes the gang can settle permanently. Dutch constantly promises that one final score will allow them to escape once and for all, and Arthur slowly realizes that the destination doesn't really exist at all. And because of this, Arthur might initially view the prison as just another camp rather than the beginning of a civilization. Rick is better at giving people hope. Even when Rick is unstable, he understands that surviving without a future eventually destroys people. Now, Arthur would be amazing at protecting the prison, but Herschel, Glenn, or another optimistic member of the group might need to convince him to invest in farming, education, and long-term rebuilding. And once Arthur accepted that the prison could become a home, he would work harder than almost anyone to protect it. Arthur is intensely loyal to people he considers family. He spends most of RDR2 doing exhausting and dangerous work because he believes the gang depends on him. But that loyalty also creates another problem. Arthur might become too protective of the original Atlanta group and too suspicious of outsiders. Rick sometimes makes terrible decisions, but he gradually learns that communities must accept new people to survive, especially in a situation like this. And Arthur comes from a world where strangers regularly turn out to be bounty hunters, rival gangs, or even lawmen. So trusting people has repeatedly cost him his friend, and he's scared of that. Now, when it comes to being against the governor, Arthur might initially perform better than Rick, but Rick would ultimately be the more inspiring leader again. Arthur has much more experience dealing with rival gangs and dishonest leaders. Woodbury would immediately make him uncomfortable. The governor presents himself as a reasonable man protecting his people, but Arthur has spent years watching Dutch charm strangers while hiding his true intentions. Arthur would notice the governor's need for control, his carefully constructed image, and the fear beneath the loyalty of his people, and he would probably trust Michonne's instincts earlier and avoid giving the governor sensitive information. When the war began, Arthur would be at an enormous advantage. He is skilled at ambushes and attacking fortified positions, and instead of waiting for the governor to strike the prison repeatedly, Arthur might organize a smaller group to weaken Woodbury's weapons and vehicles beforehand. But Rick accomplished something Arthur might struggle to do. He persuaded the people of Woodbury to join the prison. Now Arthur knows how to destroy an enemy gang. If anything, he knows how to do it better than Rick. But Rick knows how to separate innocent followers from the leader controlling them. That distinction is essential in The Walking Dead. Rick eventually realizes that killing every person on the opposite side only creates another cycle of revenge. Now Arthur reaches a similar realization near the end of his life, but it takes him decades. Earlier, Arthur might view Woodbury as one united enemy and fail to recognize how many people were simply afraid of the governor. After the prison fell, Arthur would be at his absolute best. Life on the road is where Arthur has the clearest advantage over Rick. He would know how to select campsites and detect enemies before they surround the group. The Claimers would be a perfect example for this. Rick is captured because Joe's group tracks him after Rick kills one of their members. Rick ultimately saves Carl by biting Joe's throat, proving that he will use any level of violence to protect his son. It is one of Rick's most brutal but understandable actions. The episode then leads the survivors to Terminus, where they discover that the apparent sanctuary is a trap, and Arthur is just as capable of that level of violence. When Jack is kidnapped in RDR2, Arthur joins the gang's assault on the manor. He does not hesitate, negotiate, or show mercy to the people at all. They burn that house down to a crisp. They showed no mercy whatsoever. Now, Terminus would still be dangerous because its residents deliberately appeared welcoming. However, Arthur is naturally suspicious of anything that seems too perfect. Dutch spent years selling the gang dreams of paradise, so signs promising sanctuary would probably make Arthur more cautious, not less. Now, Alexandria would become Arthur's greatest psychological challenge. When Rick arrives at Alexandria, he initially believes its residents are too weak to survive, and he becomes convinced that he must take control before the community destroys itself. But over time, Rick then learns to combine his survival instincts with Alexandria's desire for civilization. Arthur would also see Alexandria as dangerously unprepared. He would immediately notice poor weapon discipline, inexperienced residents, and people who have survived mostly through sheer luck. Unlike Rick, however, Arthur might feel uncomfortable living inside of a peaceful suburban community. Arthur has literally never experienced a normal adult life, especially in this modern timeline at all. Even before the apocalypse, he belonged to an outlaw gang that survived outside society. He might sleep outside, avoid the houses, and continue behaving as though the group needed to leave at any moment. And that is low-key pretty good, but also it's kind of a blessing and a curse. Yet Alexandria could also give something Arthur has never received in his own world, a genuine opportunity to start over. Near the end of RDR2, Arthur begins helping John escape the gang because he understands that John, Abigail, and Jack still have a chance to become a real family. Arthur does not believe he can save himself, but he believes he can save them. In Alexandria, Arthur would become surrounded by people offering him a second chance before he was dying. He might never become comfortable giving speeches, but people would begin respecting him because he worked beside them. Arthur would train the residents to shoot, help them reinforce the walls, and personally handle the most dangerous jobs. This is where Arthur's leadership style would separate from Rick's. Rick leads from the front, but he also understands politics. He negotiates between communities and convinces groups with different values to fight for a shared future. Arthur leads through personal loyalty. People follow him because they know he will risk his life for them. Arthur would be an excellent leader of a smaller group. Everyone would trust him in a fight, and he would never ask someone to take a risk he would not take himself, but controlling Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, and Oceanside would require more than just loyalty. It would require diplomacy. Rick is better suited for that position, and the Saviors would prove this. Arthur could easily kill Negan without a doubt. In a direct confrontation, Arthur's speed and accuracy would make him extremely dangerous. But defeating the Saviors was not always about simply killing Negan. Rick needed to unite several communities and convince frightened people that resistance was possible. Arthur struggled to challenge Dutch even when the Van der Linde gang was much smaller. His loyalty and self-doubt kept him trapped beneath a leader he no longer trusted, and that hesitation could become catastrophic against Negan. He would recognize Arthur as the group's strongest enforcer and try to convince him that they were smaller men. He might argue that Arthur had spent his life robbing and killing people, while Negan was simply more honest about it. Earlier, Arthur would be affected by that argument, but High Honor Arthur would reject it. Arthur would fight the Saviors, but Rick would probably manage the war better. Rick's decision to spare Negan would be the greatest disagreement between them. Arthur understands mercy, but he also understands what happens when dangerous men are allowed to retain influence, and Arthur would likely believe killing Negan was absolutely necessary. Now, Rick's decision eventually becomes part of his effort to end the cycle of constant execution and revenge. Arthur might need time to understand that Rick was not sparing Negan because Negan deserved forgiveness. He was sparing him because communities needed laws that were stronger than the one leader's anger. This represents Rick's greatest advantage. Rick eventually tries to connect the community through trade and construction, with the bridge becoming a symbol of cooperation. His apparent sacrifice occurs when he destroys that bridge to stop a walker herd from reaching the community, and Arthur would absolutely make that sacrifice as well. Arthur's final act in Red Dead Redemption 2 is helping John escape. Even though Arthur knows he is dying, he stays behind because John has a family and a future. If Arthur were injured while a herd approached, he would make the same basic choice Rick made. But the thing is, Arthur might not have built the bridge in the first place. That is the final difference between them.